James stepped off the transport ship with a heavy heart, the weight of the past few months weighing on his shoulders. After years of service as a soldier in a faraway galaxy, the familiar sight of Earth's blue skies felt like a distant memory. His mission had ended, and the war that had brought him to distant planets was over. He had seen and experienced things that would haunt him forever, but there was one thing, one person, he couldn't shake from his mind: Zara. Zara was an alien, fierce and powerful, a leader of a faction that had once stood against the very forces James had fought for. Their first encounter had been in the midst of a violent war, with explosions lighting up the sky and metal ships crashing down like falling stars. Despite everything, Zara had shown him a different side of herself. She wasn't just a soldier. She was someone with a past, a future, and dreams of her own. Over time, they had formed a bond, built on trust and survival. But in the end, James had to leave her behind when the mission was over. His mind raced as he walked through the bustling streets of the city. He thought about Zara and the promise he made to her to keep in touch after everything was finished. But time and distance had a way of clouding memories, and he had moved on. Earth was home now, and he tried to convince himself that he could find peace here. That was until he arrived at his apartment. It wasn't the grandest place, but it had been his sanctuary after every mission. As he turned the key and stepped inside, something felt off. The air felt heavier, almost as if someone had been there. His eyes darted around the room, and he saw it. His personal belongings were out of place. His favorite chair moved across the room, his papers scattered. Who could have been here? James thought, tension rising in his chest. He reached for his gun instinctively, his military training kicking in. There was no sound, no movement. His apartment was silent, except for the low hum of the city outside. He moved cautiously through the darkened hallway, his pulse quickening. Then, without warning, the door to the living room creaked open. James' heart skipped a beat. He had been alone just a few moments ago, but now, a shadow moved in the doorway. James raised his weapon, ready for a fight, but when the figure stepped into the light, he froze. Zara. She stood there, her tall figure framed in the doorway, her alien features unmistakable. Her skin shimmered with an otherworldly glow, and her eyes, a piercing shade of violet, locked onto his. She looked both fierce and broken at the same time. "Did you leave me, human?" she asked, her voice cold, yet filled with something James couldn't quite place. Hurt, fear, or maybe something deeper. The words struck him like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he couldn't speak. It was as though the world around him had stopped, leaving only the two of them standing in this impossible moment. How had she found him? Why was she here? James began, but his words failed him. It had been months since he last saw her, and yet here she was, standing in his home like a ghost from his past. He had promised her that he wouldn't abandon her, but life had happened, and he had moved on. Earth was supposed to be his fresh start, his escape from the endless wars and the chaos of the galaxy. But now, the universe had thrown him back into the fire. Zara's gaze softened, just slightly, but there was still a coldness to her. "You left me, and now I followed you. Do you think I would just let you go?" James didn't know what to say. The woman who had once been an enemy, who had fought against everything he stood for, was now standing in his apartment, vulnerable and full of emotion. He had never expected this. Zara wasn't like any alien he had encountered. She was strong, intelligent, and unlike the others of her species, she didn't trust easily. But she had trusted him, and he had walked away. The silence between them was thick, the tension palpable. Zara took a step forward, her eyes searching his face for some kind of answer. But there was nothing he could give her. "I didn't think you'd come after me," he finally managed to say, his voice low. I thought you'd be fine on your own." Her expression hardened again. "You think I could just go back to my people after what we went through? After everything I've seen? No, James, I'm not safe. I never will be." James' mind raced as he processed what she was saying. He had been so focused on his own life, on trying to forget everything that had happened, that he hadn't considered the consequences of leaving her behind. Zara had no one now, not on her homeworld, not in the galaxy. "I'm sorry," he whispered, lowering his weapon. He didn't know what else to say, but the apology felt like the only thing that mattered. Zara didn't respond immediately. She simply stepped further into the apartment, the weight of her presence filling the space. Her eyes softened for a moment, but then the coldness returned. She turned her back to him, facing the window as if lost in thought. "I didn't come here for your pity," she said quietly. "I came because I need you. I don't have a choice anymore." James stood there, his mind swirling with 1,000 thoughts. He couldn't deny that part of him was relieved to see her again. But he also knew that this wasn't just a reunion. It was a danger to both of them. Zara's enemies were still out there, and now they would be after her on Earth. And for the first time in a long while, James realized that his life was about to get a whole lot more complicated. After Zara stepped into James' life again, things quickly became chaotic. What had started as an unexpected reunion now felt like a whirlwind of confusion, danger, and even a strange sense of attraction that neither of them fully understood. The first challenge, James realized, was getting Zara to adapt to Earth. She was no longer in her alien environment, where her strength and advanced technology gave her an edge. Now, on Earth, she was an outsider. Her alien nature was obvious to anyone who looked at her. Her glowing skin, violet eyes, and the unmistakable aura of someone who didn't belong in this world. Zara, however, didn't see it as a problem. She was used to being different, and in fact, had always embraced it. But James saw the way people stared when they walked through the streets. Zara's presence was magnetic, and it was clear that she wasn't from around here. It didn't help that Zara had zero understanding of Earth's technology. James watched in amusement and mild horror as she tried to figure out a simple smartphone. She held it in her hands like it was some sort of alien artifact. Pressing random buttons, she managed to unlock the phone, only to accidentally hack into a local store's security system. What just happened? Zara looked up at him, her face a mix of curiosity and confusion. "You just hacked into a store's database," James said, shaking his head. "This is why we don't give advanced technology to beginners." He quickly turned off the phone, trying to prevent further chaos. Zara grinned sheepishly, clearly amused by her own mistake. "I didn't mean to do that. It's just, the tech here is so primitive compared to what I'm used to." She shrugged, still clearly adjusting to her new surroundings. Despite their differences, James found himself laughing. There was something comforting about her, even in the middle of the chaos. Maybe it was her straightforwardness, her confidence in the face of the unknown, or the way she made him forget the stress of his own life. But he quickly remembered their reality. This wasn't some strange but fun adventure. Zara wasn't here to explore Earth's technology. She was here because she had no choice. Her enemies were coming for her, and she was desperate for protection. The problem was that the more time she spent on Earth, the more attention they attracted. At first, James tried to go back to his regular routine. He had a job, friends, and responsibilities, things that made Earth feel like home. But now, with Zara in his life, every plan seemed impossible. She couldn't go out in public without causing a scene. She wasn't just an alien. She was a target, and there were dangerous people hunting her down. James knew that he had to help her, but how? His life had been relatively simple until now. He'd fought in wars, faced deadly enemies, and risked his life for causes he didn't always believe in. But Zara was different. She was the key to something much bigger, something James couldn't even begin to comprehend. One night, as they sat in his apartment, James finally confronted her. "You need to tell me more about what's going on, Zara. Why are they after you? What happened?" Zara paused, staring out the window into the dark sky. Her expression turned serious, as if she was wrestling with the words she didn't want to say. "I wasn't always like this," she said softly. I was part of a faction that stood against those in power in my world. They didn't like that I was different, that I wanted to see things change. And when I left to join the rebellion, they made me a target. James listened closely, trying to understand. So, the people hunting you, they want to stop you from spreading whatever message you have. Zara nodded. Yes. They want me dead, James. I'm the last person who could lead a revolution, and that's why they want to silence me. But I'm not running anymore. I'm done hiding. James could see the determination in her eyes. She wasn't just some alien running from her past. She was someone with a mission, a purpose. But now, that mission had dragged her to Earth, and James had no idea how to help her fulfill it. I don't know what to do, James admitted, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. I'm not some hero. I've fought battles before, but this is different. You're different. Zara turned to him then, her violet eyes softening. You're stronger than you think, James. You don't have to be a hero to help me. I wouldn't have come here if I didn't trust you. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He wasn't a hero, but for her, he could be. Zara had trusted him enough to follow him across the galaxy, and now it was his turn to trust her. But even as they spoke, James knew that time was running out. The bounty hunters were closing in. He had no way of knowing how long they had before the first wave of mercenaries would arrive, but he could feel the storm building. Whatever happens, James said, looking at Zara with newfound resolve, we'll face it together. I don't know how, but we'll make it work. Zara smiled then, her face lighting up with a warmth James hadn't seen before. For a moment, the tension of the situation melted away, and they were just two people trying to survive in a world that didn't understand them. But their peace was short-lived. The following morning, as James was preparing to head out for work, he received an alert. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the message. Mercenaries spotted in the city. Zara's enemies had arrived, and this time, there was nowhere to run. The warning came in the form of a flashing red light on James' comm device. His heart sank as he read the message, his mind racing. Mercenaries spotted in the city, it repeated over and over, as if to remind him that the danger was closer than he thought. He immediately turned to Zara, who was sitting on the couch, trying to adjust to life on Earth. Her alien beauty, once a symbol of mystery and power, now seemed like a glaring target for anyone looking to find her. We don't have much time, James said, his voice tense. He had always been a soldier, trained to react quickly, but this wasn't a typical mission. Zara wasn't just an asset. She was someone he cared for, and now her life was in his hands. Zara stood up, her eyes narrowing. She could sense the danger in the air, the way James' expression had shifted from calm to alert. They're here, she asked, already knowing the answer. James nodded. They've been tracking you since we left the ship. We're not safe here anymore. Zara didn't respond right away, but her posture stiffened, and James could tell she was preparing herself for what was to come. She wasn't the type to back down. In her world, she had faced far worse enemies. Enemies who would rather see her dead than alive. Earth, for all its comfort, was just another battleground in her eyes. I've fought mercenaries before, Zara said, her voice low but determined. But they've never fought me on my terms. Now, we make our stand. James was taken aback by her calm demeanor. She wasn't afraid, not even in the face of what was coming. But then again, he had seen her fight before. He knew she had the strength, the skill, and the will to survive. He wasn't so sure about himself, though. What do you need me to do? James asked. He had no illusions about being a soldier in this fight. He wasn't trained for what Zara had gone through, but he was going to protect her, no matter what. Zora's eyes softened, but only for a second. I need you to stay with me, she said simply. Together, we'll find a way to survive this. James nodded, feeling a surge of determination. If there was one thing he knew, it was that he wouldn't let anything happen to her. She had risked everything to come to Earth. The least he could do was keep her safe. They moved quickly, gathering supplies and making plans. James had to think fast. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the mercenaries to come knocking. He had to find a way to make the first move, to gain the upper hand before they arrived. The first step was to get out of the apartment. Staying in one place would only make them an easier target. James grabbed a few essentials: weapons, a communications device, and his most important possession, a small holo projector he used to communicate with the outside world. He passed them to Zara, who handled the technology with ease. "Where do we go now?" James asked, his mind working through the options. Zara glanced around, her eyes sharp as she considered the possibilities. "We need to head to the underground tunnels. It's a network of old passages beneath the city. They're perfect for hiding out and moving undetected." James didn't hesitate. He trusted Zora's instincts, even if the idea of navigating underground tunnels in a city full of danger seemed like a nightmare. They didn't have a choice. The mercenaries would be combing the streets, searching for any sign of Zora. With the plans in place, they quickly left the apartment, stepping into the streets of the city. The air was thick with tension as they made their way to the hidden entrance of the tunnel system. Zara walked with the confidence of someone who had done this before, while James kept his eyes open for any signs of trouble. As they reached the entrance, Zara motioned for him to follow her down into the shadows. The tunnels were dark and narrow, with only the occasional flicker of old lights to guide their way. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the stone walls, making it feel like the whole world was listening. "We'll be safe here," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. James wasn't so sure. He had always believed that no place could be truly safe, not when someone like Zara had enemies hunting her down. But for now, the tunnels would have to do. The deeper they went, the colder it became. The air was musty and thick with the scent of old stone and forgotten places. It felt like the city above had forgotten these tunnels even existed. Zara moved with the grace of someone who knew every twist and turn of this underground labyrinth. She had been here before, perhaps many times, when she had to evade pursuers in her past life. James stayed close, his hand never far from his weapon. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It was as though the shadows themselves were closing in around them. Suddenly, a noise broke the silence, distant but unmistakable. Footsteps. The sound of boots echoing through the tunnels, getting closer and closer. Zara froze, her eyes flashing with alarm. "They'd found us," she said, her voice cold and calculating. James didn't need to ask who they were. He could feel it in his gut. The mercenaries had tracked them down. They were close now, and there was no time to run. They had no choice but to fight. Zora moved quickly, pulling him behind a corner, out of sight. She gestured for him to stay quiet. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and James held his breath. Through the dim light, James could just make out the figures of the mercenaries as they passed. They were armed, their expressions cold and professional. It was clear they had no interest in negotiation. Zara's grip on her weapon tightened, and James could see the calm fury in her eyes. They were here to end this once and for all, and she wasn't going to let them win. The mercenaries passed them without noticing, but it was only a matter of time before they realized they were being hunted. Zara's enemies had arrived, and now the real battle was about to begin. The hours spent in the dark tunnels felt like days to James. Every footstep that echoed down the stone corridors made his heart race, and every flicker of light made his eyes dart nervously. He had never been in a situation like this before, not even in his most dangerous missions. Zara, however, was calm, moving with the confidence of someone who had spent her life on the run. As they continued through the tunnels, Zara's sharp eyes scanned every shadow, every corner, always alert to the slightest sound. James tried to keep up, but it was clear that she was in her element, while he was simply trying to adapt to the chaos of the situation. It wasn't long before Zara stopped, pulling him to a halt with a quiet gesture. "We need to make camp here for the night," she said, her voice low. "We'll be safer if we don't keep moving." The mercenaries will be looking for us, and we need to be ready when they do." James nodded, feeling a sense of unease. He didn't like staying in one place for too long, especially when they were being hunted. But Zara's decision made sense. If they kept moving, they'd only exhaust themselves and make mistakes. They set up a small camp in one of the wider sections of the tunnels, using what little they had for warmth and comfort. The air was damp and cold, but it didn't bother Zara. She seemed perfectly at ease in the underground labyrinth, while James could hardly shake the chill in his bones. As night fell, Zara turned to him, her expression serious. "I know you're not used to this, James, but you need to learn how to defend yourself. If we're going to survive this, you need to be able to fight, and fight well." James frowned, his mind racing. He had seen enough combat to know that survival wasn't just about brute strength. It was about strategy, skill, and knowing when to act. But he also knew that his training didn't compare to Zara's. She was an alien warrior with advanced technology at her disposal, while he was just a man with basic military training. "I'm not sure I'm the best person for this," James admitted, feeling a little defeated. "I'm not like you, Zara. I don't have your skills." Zara smiled, but there was no mocking in her expression. "That's why I'm here to teach you. You have potential, James. You've survived this long because of it. But we can't afford to rely on luck anymore. You need to trust in your instincts and learn to fight like your life depends on it. Because it does." James hesitated, but something in her words stirred a deep sense of determination inside him. He had faced impossible odds before and somehow come out alive. Maybe this time, he could do more than just survive. Maybe he could actually fight back. "All right," James said, his voice firmer than before. "Teach me." Zara didn't waste any time. She immediately started with the basics: how to move silently, how to stay hidden, how to use the environment to your advantage. Every lesson she gave him felt like it was both simple and complex at the same time. She would demonstrate a move, then expect him to replicate it. The first time he tried to sneak past her without making a sound, he failed miserably, tripping over a loose stone and nearly giving away their position. Zara didn't scold him. Instead, she helped him up, her eyes calm and patient. "You'll get it," she said. "The key is to stay in control. Don't think too much. Let your body take over." James took a deep breath and tried again. This time, he moved slower, focusing on the rhythm of his body rather than his nerves. Zara watched him closely, and when he finally managed to move past her without a sound, she gave him a small nod of approval. "Good," she said. "That's progress. Now, let's move on to something more challenging." The next lesson involved hand-to-hand combat. Zara showed him how to use leverage to throw an opponent, how to disable someone without killing them. The moves were fluid, elegant, and efficient, and James quickly realized that Zara wasn't just a warrior, she was a master. Every punch, every block, every movement she made was calculated to get the best result with the least effort. At first, James felt clumsy. He was used to brute force, to charging into situations headfirst. But Zara kept correcting him, her voice steady and clear. "You don't need to be strong, James. You need to be precise." By the end of the night, he was exhausted, his muscles sore from the constant repetition of techniques. But despite his fatigue, there was a sense of accomplishment growing inside him. Zara had taught him more in a few hours than he had learned in years of military service. As they sat down to rest, Zara handed him a small ration pack. "You're doing well," she said, her voice softer now. "But remember, this is only the beginning. We'll need everything we've learned if we're going to escape the mercenaries and survive this war." James nodded, his mind still processing the information. He had always thought of himself as capable, as someone who could handle any situation. But the reality was that he had a lot to learn if he was going to survive what was coming. In the silence that followed, James realized something else. Zara wasn't just a warrior. She was also a teacher and perhaps a friend. He couldn't ignore the bond that was forming between them. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust. She was teaching him to fight, but she was also teaching him to trust in his own abilities. As they sat together, the weight of their situation pressed down on them. But for the first time, James felt ready. Ready to fight. Ready to survive. And maybe, just maybe, ready to face whatever danger the mercenaries were bringing their way. The bond between them had grown stronger over the course of the night, forged in the heat of training and the shared goal of survival. Whatever happened next, James knew one thing for certain. They weren't alone anymore, and together they stood a chance against the enemy. The moment of truth had arrived. The mercenaries were closing in, and there was no more running. Zara and James had spent days moving through the hidden tunnels of the city, trying to stay one step ahead of their pursuers, but now it was time to face them head-on. There was no more time to hide, no more time for training. The final battle was upon them. James could feel his heart racing in his chest as they crouched behind a large, broken-down building on the outskirts of the city. The sound of distant footsteps echoed in the streets, the unmistakable rhythm of heavy boots belonging to the mercenaries who had been hunting them for so long. The time for running was over. Zara stood up, her face a picture of calm determination. Her alien features, usually so unreadable, now seemed to glow with an intensity James had never seen before. She was ready. They both were. "We've trained for this," Zara said quietly, turning to James. "Trust your instincts. Stay focused, and we'll get through this." James nodded, his hand tightening around the weapon she had taught him to use. The weight of it felt familiar now. In the past few days, he had learned more than he ever thought possible. He had learned to move with purpose, to fight with precision, and most importantly, to believe in himself. But as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, doubt crept into his mind. He had never been in a battle like this. He had never fought against enemies as skilled as the mercenaries closing in on them. Would he be able to protect Zara? But then he looked at her. Her steady gaze met his, and in that moment, he knew there was no turning back. They had come this far together, and he wouldn't let her down now. "We're ready," James said, his voice firm. Without another word, Zara moved swiftly, disappearing into the shadows. James followed closely behind, his breath shallow with nerves. They navigated the back alleys of the city, moving like ghosts through the night. The mercenaries were getting closer, and every second counted. Zara's instincts led them to a high vantage point overlooking the street where the mercenaries were patrolling. They had set up a trap. James couldn't help but feel a rush of adrenaline as he crouched next to Zara, watching their enemies below. The mercenaries were spread out, searching for any sign of them, but they didn't know the trap had already been set. "Stay low," Zara whispered. "We'll pick them off one by one." Quietly. James nodded. This was their moment. As Zara moved to take her first shot, James felt the rush of the battlefield consume him. His mind cleared, his body responding without hesitation. The first mercenary fell silently, a clean shot to the neck. James barely had time to process it before Zara had already moved on to the next target. And then the next. They were a well-oiled machine. Every move was calculated, every strike precise. Zara's training had paid off, and now it was time to put it to the test. The mercenaries, who had once seemed so confident, were now caught off guard, unaware of the deadly ambush waiting for them. But just as they thought they had the upper hand, the mercenaries regrouped. James could hear the click of weapons being readied, the unmistakable sound of guns being cocked. The trap had been sprung, but they were still outnumbered. "We need to move," Zara said urgently, grabbing James by the arm. She pulled him back toward the shadows as the mercenaries opened fire. James's heart pounded in his chest as they sprinted through the dark streets, dodging the gunfire that came from every direction. The night was alive with the sound of weapons and shouts. James could hear his own breath, harsh and ragged in his ears, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Not when Zora's life depended on him. They reached an old warehouse at the end of the street, the perfect place for their final stand. Zara ducked inside, motioning for James to follow. They knew the mercenaries would chase them here, and they had one last chance to make their stand. The warehouse was large and empty, the perfect setting for the final showdown. James grabbed a stack of crates, setting up makeshift cover for them both. Zara moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. They had no choice but to hold their ground. "They're coming," Zara said, her voice steady, though James could see the tension in her posture. "We need to take them out before they can regroup." James felt a sense of calm settle over him. This was it. Everything they had done so far, all the training, all the running, had led to this moment. If they were going to survive, they had to fight together, using everything they had learned. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer. James could hear the mercenaries moving into position, trying to flank them from both sides. He steadied his weapon, his hand steady despite the pounding of his heart. Zara stood beside him, her focus unwavering. "On my signal," Zara whispered, "we move." And then it happened. The first mercenary appeared, stepping into the open, and before he could react, Zara was already in motion. She moved like lightning, taking him down with a single strike. The others followed, coming out of the shadows to engage them in a chaotic firefight. James moved quickly, firing in short bursts, his shots landing with precision. The mercenaries were no match for their coordinated assault. One by one, they fell, each one a testament to the training and bond James and Zara had built together. But the fight wasn't over. There were still more mercenaries, more danger to face. Zara was a blur of motion, her skills honed by years of experience, but she couldn't do it alone. James was right beside her, fighting with a determination he hadn't known he was capable of. He could hear the sound of his own gunfire, feel the heat of the battle in his bones, but he knew they couldn't stop now. And then, in the final moments of the battle, they saw the leader of the mercenaries. He was massive, armed with a weapon far more advanced than anything they had seen before. But Zara didn't hesitate. She moved toward him, her weapon raised, and James followed. Together, they fought. It was a battle of skill, of strategy, and of willpower. And in the end, it was their bond, born from training, from trust, and from survival, that made the difference. The mercenary leader fell, his weapon clattering to the ground as he went down. Exhausted but victorious, James and Zara stood together in the aftermath. The warehouse was silent now, the battle over. They had won, not just because they had the skills, but because they had each other. And in that moment, as the dust settled and the adrenaline began to fade, James knew that they were no longer just survivors. They were a team. And no one could take that away from them. The smoke was still rising from the battlefield, and the city, once a symbol of oppression and fear, now lay in ruins. But amidst the destruction, there was hope. The battle had been won, and the mercenaries who had once thought themselves invincible were no longer a threat. James and Zara stood together, looking out over the wreckage, the weight of everything they had fought for settling into their hearts. It was over. James glanced at Zara, her alien features bathed in the fading light of the setting sun. She had been by his side through every challenge, every battle. And now, for the first time, they were standing on the edge of something new, something better. The war was behind them, but the future still awaited. "Is it really over?" James asked, his voice soft as he turned to Zara. The question was as much for himself as it was for her. After everything they had endured, it was hard to believe that the war was finally over. Zara's expression was unreadable, her eyes scanning the horizon, but her voice was filled with certainty. "For us, yes. But the work has just begun." James took a deep breath, nodding slowly. He understood. The world around them might have been torn apart, but it was still their world to rebuild. They had survived the worst, and now it was time to forge a new path. One without fear, one without the shadow of the mercenaries looming over them. But rebuilding a world wasn't an easy task. Zara and James knew that. The victory had been hard-earned, but now they would have to face the consequences of the destruction. The city needed to be rebuilt. The people needed healing. And while Zara had proven herself to be a fierce warrior, there was another side of her, one that would need to come to the forefront now. She was more than just a fighter. She was a leader. James watched as she took a step forward, her eyes focused on the distant horizon, her posture straight and confident. In that moment, he saw not just the warrior who had fought beside him, but a woman who had survived and thrived in a world that had constantly sought to tear her down. Zara had always been strong, but now she was something more. She was a beacon of hope. "We'll need allies," Zara said, her voice steady. "The people here will need leadership. We can't rebuild everything alone." James nodded. He had been thinking the same thing. As much as they had done, as much as they had fought, they couldn't do it all. The future of the city, the future of the world they now found themselves in, would rely on the support of others. They had already proven that humans and aliens could work together, that despite the odds, they could survive. But now, they needed to unite the people and forge new relationships. Zara turned to him, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "James, I need you by my side. You're not just my partner in battle. You're my partner in this new world. Together, we can lead them." James felt a surge of emotion rush through him. There was something in her words, in the way she looked at him, that made him realize just how far they had come. They had both fought for survival. But now, they were fighting for something bigger, for a future, for a new beginning. And in that future, Zara wanted him by her side. "I'm with you," James said, his voice firm and unwavering. "Whatever it takes." Zara gave him a small, approving nod before turning her attention back to the city. There was still so much work to do. The damage had been done, and the people were scared. But James knew that together, they could rebuild it. They could rebuild everything. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the ruins, James and Zara made their way to what was left of the city's central square. It was a symbol of their past, of the battles they had fought and the lives they had lost. But now, it could also be a symbol of their future, a place where new beginnings could grow. The square was eerily quiet, but there were signs of life. People were emerging from the wreckage, tentative and uncertain, but hopeful. They had seen the battle unfold, and they had seen the humans and aliens fighting together. Now they needed to see leadership. They needed to see someone who could guide them, someone who could show them that despite everything they had been through, a brighter future was still possible. Zara stepped forward, her voice carrying across the square. "We have won the battle," she said, her tone strong and resolute. "But this is only the beginning. Together, we can rebuild. Together, we can create a future where we all stand united. No more fighting. No more war. We will create a world where peace reigns, where everyone, human or alien, has a place. This is our new beginning." The crowd that had gathered listened in silence, their faces a mix of uncertainty and hope. Zara's words had struck a chord with them. James watched as people began to step forward, coming together, joining in the vision of a new world. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be perfect. But it was possible. James turned to Zara, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You really know how to rally a crowd." Zara smiled back, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "I had a good teacher." James chuckled, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in days. He had fought battles, faced impossible odds, and come out the other side. But now, he was fighting for something new, for a chance to build something better. And he wasn't alone. He had Zara, and together, they would make sure that the future they were creating would be one worth fighting for. As the crowd began to disperse, slowly moving toward their homes and families, James and Zara stood together, looking out at the city that would soon rise from the ashes. The road ahead would be long, but they were ready for it. They had fought for survival. Now they would fight for a future. And in that future, there would be no more battles. Only hope. Only a new beginning.